Good morning and welcome to our second live streaming of our church services for the Freeborn Church. We're glad you're here this morning. We hope you're staying safe and that you and your family are enjoying some of this time together. And we just appreciate you for you being here this morning, and we just want to open in a word of prayer, shall we? Heavenly Father, I pray that you'd bless our time together this morning. Those who are at home, I pray that they would feel that they have an opportunity to interact with us. They would still feel some body ministry and closeness, even though we're not physically together right now. And I pray that you'd bless them in heart and mind, that they would grow in the Spirit and use this opportunity of social isolation or separation to dig into your word deeper, to spend more time in getting to know you, and to energize their prayer life, to pray for the things that are both needed and for the growth of the church and the gospel. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I kind of want to start today, not so much as a formal message, of course, because we've really enjoyed this format where we could have some interaction, but I wanted to start today in 1 Peter. And I want to do this overview of 1 Peter, and then I want to dive into part of chapter 4. And I want to deal with a couple of strong issues that we find, not just as a result of this current social climate and this current emergency, if that's what we want to call it, with a coronavirus, but really kind of in a larger context. So if you go to 1 Peter chapter 1 with me, I just want to look at the first verse, and I want to see the introduction, Peter's introduction to it, and see how it looks. He says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Now that's a big piece of geography. That is not a small piece of land. You understand? He's writing this letter so that it can go out, and he's expecting this letter to travel very, very far. When you look at this introduction to this letter, the thing that strikes me is the directionality of this introduction. It's almost all eastward from where he is. In fact, it is all eastward from where he is at the time, right? At this time, Peter's probably in Rome. This is about 64 AD. 67 AD, the persecution of Nero rises up, and very shortly after that, both Paul and Peter are martyred under Roman persecution. And when he writes this, he writes it and sends it out, probably from Rome. He refers to it as Babylon, and it's probably written out from Rome. And every point he's writing to is moving further and further eastward from there. And I think that's an important point. One of the reasons that that's an important point is because the church at the time was growing far more eastward than westward. There's a huge part of Christian history that, for the most part, doesn't show up in our view of the church. And that is what happened in the centuries after Christ when the gospel moved eastward. And I want to talk about some of that today. I'm going to give you a little bit of, I got a little bit of information about that, the movement of the church and directionality of it at the time. But I just kind of want to introduce it by noting here how Peter writes this letter to all these people moving eastward, all these Christians who are under persecution at the time, right? And then go just a little bit further. We're going to kind of hit a couple of highlights as we go through here to see context for this book. Because if you don't see the context for this book and why he's writing it and the main points he's making, you can get lost in all the minor points along the way. And so I want to deal with the main points. And the main points he's making through this book are all about trials and tribulations and the way we as Christians ought to live and how we ought to handle ourselves in the midst of trying times. That's his whole purpose for writing the book. He doesn't deal with hardly anything else in the book. There's a couple of times when he stitches doctrine of salvation and redemption into that conversation about how we ought to live. But he's stitching it in to remind us of where we've come from and where we're going through so that we can get a kind of a frame around whatever it is we happen to be going through at the time. And framing it with, by the way, you know where you came from, and you were redeemed by the power of God, and you're kept by the power of God, and you're going to be delivered to glory by the power of God. So whatever you're going through right now has to be completely subservient or subtexted to that greater text of who you are in Christ and what you're going and where you came from, where you're going to, etc. So go down to verse 11 of chapter 2. And notice how he addresses them. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to king as supreme, or unto governor, or unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So I'm going to put this in the context of kind of what the church is going through right now here, which I think is a very tiny issue, right? This coronavirus thing is such a tiny issue. Yeah. It is nothing really, is it? I mean, we're not being persecuted. We're not being hunted. We're not doing that, right? But we've got a lot of new ordinances that we have to obey, right? Like, not going out places, and being in groups of 10 or less, and basically staying home, and all of those things, which are just, for us, nothing more than inconvenience. And for a lot of us, when we look at them, we think, that seems like an unnecessary thing to do. But here Peter is saying, look, even in that scenario, you ought to submit yourself to it. Why? Well, it has nothing to do with your own safety. He doesn't say, well, in order that you might be safe, submit yourself to the ordinances of man. He says, no, tell you what you need to do. You need to submit yourself to this, not because of some, safety on your part, but because you need to deal with people who are ignorant. They really have their own very small frame of reality. And you need to be able to put to silence their objections. They don't need to have a whole lot to object about you with, right? That's his thing. Now go down to verse 19 of chapter 2. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. In fact, if you go down to verse 21, for even so hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow in his steps. You know that whole thing that was a few years ago about what would Jesus do, and everybody had those WWJD bracelets and things like that on, and I get it. And Charles Sheldon wrote that famous book one time. I recommend it. I think it's very good reading. I think it's an interesting thought of what would Jesus do. He sort of started that thing. It's called In His Steps, is the title of the book. And it is a Christian classic. And it has moved a lot of people. And it's a great proposition. But I want you to know that thought didn't have anything to do in context with any of the intellectual or moral challenges of our day. It had to do with suffering innocently. When you're not guilty, you've done nothing wrong, to actually still suffer for it and to endure grief. And how does he put it here in verse 21? Verse 19? Endure grief, suffering wrongfully, because you were appointed to do that. This phenomenon that we've seen of people who could be born into a Christian family, grow up as a Christian, live their life in relative peace and happiness, and die late into their 90s, never having suffered more grief than just friends and family dying and the ordinary griefs of nature, but never having suffered wrongfully for their faith in Christ, that is an unusual phenomenon. That is fantastically strange in Christian history, because it turns out we're actually appointed by God to suffer wrongfully, to be persecuted. That is our appointment by God. Now, I know you don't want that. I know I don't want that. I know we don't go out and seek that. But you understand that's what we're appointed to. And Peter is telling them this. All of these strangers scattered eastward from basically Israel eastward, who he's written this letter to, this huge population has suffered wrongfully and is appointed to suffer wrongfully. Okay, so now when you get into to chapter 3, you'll notice there's a little bit of a subject change, because now he's going to deal with the practical implications of this on us as Christians in a family. Families under stress, if you will, are addressed in chapter 3. And it'd be a great one to go through sometime, right? Because he's not dealing with, financial stress due to our own foolishness. He's really dealing with seriously bad social and economic conditions. How should we behave as Christians? And that's why he starts it out. He said, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. And then he goes down and deals with the husbands later on. And then he deals with servants later on. And he deals with the example again. He returns to that same example that you found in chapter 2 and verse 21. You find in chapter 3 and verse 18. In chapter 2:21, he says, for even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. We should be, remember the steps of Jesus Christ were, I'm going to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And the disciples said, no, you can't do that because they're going to kill you if you go there. No, and he says he set his face like a flint. He just wasn't going to hear it. We would call it today stonewalling. Right? He'd stonewalled his own disciples and just wouldn't hear a thing they said about it. Right? Because he knows, I'm going there to suffer. He's saying, you ought to be the same way. Right? We ought to follow in his steps in the sense that we don't run away from potential suffering. We keep doing the will of God irrespective of whatever suffering might be around us. And we just don't entertain the thought, and we don't listen to anybody's reasoning about it. We keep going in the direction that we're supposed to go in because we know that's what we're supposed to do, and it doesn't matter whether we suffer or not. That's what he means. Now, chapter 3 and verse 18, for Christ also hath suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. Now, he's making this comparison here for our edification, saying, you need to understand the balance of this thing. If you're going to put this down in a ledger, and you're going to look at the value of the suffering of the flesh, or the revelation of the Spirit, you would say, I would suffer in the flesh every day that the Spirit might be edified, that the Holy Spirit of God might be revealed, might have free course in the world, that I might be shown to be redeemed by God and saved by his Holy Spirit. I would suffer in the flesh every day so that would happen. And he's kind of trying to lay down comparing value of things, right? It would be like comparing the value of, like, one of my favorite shows is like the Antique Roadshow, right? And the other night on the Antiques Roadshow, there was this two different cases brought out. One of them was a document, a newspaper that had been printed at the end of the Civil War in the South, and they had very little paper resources left, so it was printed on the back of a piece of wallpaper. And it was one of only a few, very few known copies in existence of that thing. a little later on, there's a piece of jewelry that was costume jewelry made almost 100 years after that very rare piece of paper was printed in the South. But the value of that piece of costume jewelry was 3 times the value of that piece of wallpaper. Why? Because people really wanted to collect that piece of jewelry. Nobody wanted a piece of paper with writing on it. Isn't that interesting? Even though I think one is far more historically significant, the other seems to be more about show. And so people seem to value that more. And that's what Peter's doing here, is kind of comparing those things and saying, you should look at it like this. The things you ought to value are the destruction of the flesh, suffering for Christ, going willfully into tribulation if that's it, because you were called to suffer for Christ's sake, to suffer wrongfully for Christ's sake. You were called to that. And he was the great example for you. You should follow in his steps. And the destruction of the flesh and the revelation of the Spirit is so much more valuable than the flesh, that you would go for that any day, right? So he's kind of giving us that, right? All right. Now we get down to chapter 4. And I don't want to go through, I wish we could, but it would take all the time we have today to go through the practical things of how a family ought to be in times of trouble. Okay.
Do the same thing, or?
Okay. So here we are in chapter 4, verse 1. For so much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. All right, let's walk through this mindset he's asking us to adopt. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, you need a different form of armor. Now, I know Paul went through the armor of God before, but all of that is sort of defensive armor in a way. I mean, you have the sword of the Spirit, and that's offensive, but the rest of the armor is defensive armor. You know, it's armor plating on your body, and it's a shield to carry, and it's protection for your feet. This is purely offensive armor. He's saying we need to pick up a weapon that we can use. Now, oddly, it's not the weapon against the things we'd like a weapon against, right? We'd like a weapon against our enemies. We'd like a weapon against the devil. We'd like a weapon, but this is a weapon against our own flesh. And he says we need to arm our mind with the same mind that Christ had. Now again, we could spend an hour talking about the implications of this, but I just want to give you a little list of the implications of this for you to think about over time. One of them is, that means you get to choose the way you think. The way you think isn't pre-programmed into you. It isn't like genetically I'm just this way. That's not the way I think. No, you choose the way you think, and you need to think like this. That's what he means by arm your mind with this. Arm yourself with this mind, right? Paul says it in one place. He says, put on the mind of Christ, right? Having this same mind of Christ, he says. And Peter is saying that same thing, singing that same note, if you will, saying you need to arm yourself with this mind. And what is that mind? That suffering in the flesh is actually a good thing for me. Why? Because when I'm suffering in the flesh, I have ceased to sin. I can give you an example of this. A couple of years ago, I had a tooth that became abscessed. Now, if you've ever had a tooth that became abscessed, you know how painful it can be. I was in so much pain that I literally didn't care about anything else in the world. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to sleep. I didn't want a steak. Michael's like, right? I didn't want ice cream. I didn't want anything. I had no appetites. I had no desires. In fact, I seriously thought it would be better to die than to keep up with this pain. It was so excruciating. And then when I went to the dentist and he pulled that tooth and the pain stopped. I went home and I laid down in bed and I had the most peaceful night of sleep. I didn't have any disturbed dreams. I didn't have any worries. I didn't have any cares. Why? Because I'd suffered in the flesh. And he says, if you've suffered in the flesh, you've ceased from sin, and you ought to arm yourself with that mind. You ought to arm yourself with a mind that says, I am appointed to suffer for Christ's sake. Okay. Now let's go down to a little bit further down, and I want to get in the heart of kind of the meat, if you will, of this. Right? Verse 12. Beloved, think it not strange considering the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. You know, we should not think it strange when things go very, very wrong for us. Even when we suffer wrongfully. If the U.S. government actually did, if there was a shadow government of evil people that was trying to, establish a one world government and persecute Christians, and I don't believe any of that, by the way. But if it was, if that turns out to be true, if all my conspiracy theory cousins turn out to be right in everything they're posting on Facebook right now, it wouldn't matter to me at all. It shouldn't. We should look at that and say, this is not strange. Now, I want to talk to you about why I think we should think it's not strange. I just want to give a quick review of the 1900s. Just the 1900s. Just from an American perspective, right? You ever hear of the gay 90s? That was the 1890s. That was when, man, it seemed like the world was going to open up. It was going to be a world of peace and prosperity. People were, the general wealth was increasing at a phenomenal rate. People were throwing parties, and it was a time of national optimism, probably unlike anything we've ever seen before. Wow, was this great world. And then the calendar turned over to the 1900s. By 1918, you have a world war and a worldwide pandemic of influenza. When we were living in Colorado Springs, there was an incident where they were in Pueblo. I was going to college in Pueblo at the time. They were excavating. They were actually tearing out a parking lot, and they needed to regrade, I think, like 12 inches lower than that parking lot for the building they were going to put in place. And as they were grading lower and lower, they found bodies. I think, if I remember correctly, and it's been a long time, so I might have the numbers wrong, I think it was like 18 bodies or something like that, buried in that area. Now, they weren't buried like, dumped in one common grave. They were all in individual graves, but very shallow. And so, of course, the historians wanted to know, what is this about? And this is what they think. They have a record of the 1918 influenza outbreak when the supposedly last person in Pueblo, now Pueblo at the time, you got to understand, was a street with some buildings on the side of it, right? I mean, it wasn't like what we think of as the city today. When this young man, I think in his late teens, recorded burying the last people in Pueblo who died of influenza. And since he was the last one there alive, he left and he went westward to California. It was returning veterans who eventually made their way and kind of restarted Pueblo after that. But this kid records burying these last 18 people somewhere. They think that was the grave. Now you think about that for a minute. We're in 2020. That was 1918. Oddly, almost 100 years later, right at that point, we have another pandemic. We thought in the middle of the 1900s, we've defeated polio, we've defeated smallpox. You know, we're taking these diseases down one by one, and we're going to eventually eliminate suffering and disease among human beings. Do you know there was a time when we almost completely wiped out yellow fever, malaria, with the use of DDT?
Yeah.
And then when we couldn't use DDT anymore, the mosquito populations went back up, and malaria became a serious disease in parts of the world again. And my point is, it's not odd that we're going through coronavirus right now. It's just been 100 years, and we don't have good memory. Okay, so that was that part. Then you had the Roaring Twenties that came along, where the war is over, things should look good again, we should be positive again. It was an attempt to return back to kind of the optimism of the 1890s, but it was followed immediately by the Depression. And that was followed immediately by another world war. That was followed very closely with the Korean War, and timed almost coincidentally with the Cold War. Then that all was followed by the Vietnam War. And that was followed by an energy crisis. And that was followed by a decade of what I would call recovery, the 1980s, right? It was, optimism was sort of returning again. You know, the whole country was shifting a little bit to the conservative side. Fiscally, we were looking pretty good. Things were fine. And then came the decade of terror, when we had terrorism on the USS Cole, and an early attempt to bomb the Tower of the Americas, and or the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center rather, and then you had the actual bombing of the World Trade Center, and therefore we get down to today, and here's what we want to do. We want to keep going back to this over-exuberant optimism that says the whole world is good and people are basically good and the times are good, and we want to live in times when we don't have to suffer and there's nothing bad going on, and we're not going to go to those times. You understand? We were appointed to suffer. So then he says, don't think it's strange. But we do, don't we? We think this is strange. I want to read you a couple of passages for a minute. So I've been studying a lot about that side of church history that we don't normally hear, because here's what we normally hear. We hear the progression of Christianity westward. That's most of our understanding of church history, right? We get the understanding of, moving toward, from Israel toward Egypt, up into Rome and southern Europe, but the Eastern European side, and we eventually get to Ireland and the monasteries and knowledge coming out of the monasteries, and coming back into Europe, being reseeded, so to speak, from those Irish monasteries. And we sort of hear that side of Christian history. And in our minds, we see the church growing through these 10 early persecutions, which were all Western persecutions under Rome, until it finally grows out, and we see things like Constantine and Charlemagne and that whole side of history. And we're probably, now many of you may not be, and that's a shame, but most of us sort of have that view of it. And quite a few of us have a view that comes out of Roman Catholicism, because we came out of Roman Catholicism, and we see the church starting and growing up sort of in that Roman Empire and traveling the Roman trade routes. We see it that way, but there's a whole other side of Christian history that we often don't see. So let me give you a sense of this. Much of what we call today the Islamic world was once Christian. The faith originated and took shape in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And these areas continued to have major Christian communities long after the Arab conquest. As late as the 11th century, Asia was still home to at least a third of the world's Christians. Think about that for a minute. A third of the world's Christians at that time were in Asia. Now, we see a time when Asia was almost devoid of Christians, and we sent missionaries in. And we remember the stories of missionaries going to China, and going to Burma and going to Africa. But you understand there was a time when those countries actually represented the majority of Christians in the world. We're actually in the East, not in the West. What we see as Western Christianity is a fairly recent development comparatively, and in the early centuries it moved deeply eastward. Okay, now I have a reason for going through this, right? As late as the 11th century, Asia was still home to at least a third of the world's Christians, and perhaps a tenth of all Christians still lived in Africa, a figure that continent would not reach again until the 1960s. Even in 1250, it still made sense to think of a Christian world stretching east from Constantinople to Samarkand, and south from Alexandria to the desert of Ogaden. Think about how big that piece of land is. Think that is essentially from the Middle East, eastward and southward, were the greatest part of the spread of Christianity long before what we come to see as Christian development. Things like the Reformation and the movements of Christianity across Europe and the conquest of Europe by Christianity and all of that kind of stuff. That was all a late stage player by comparison to the Christianity that went eastward. Now the reason that I bring this out is, what happened to those people? What happened to those churches? What we think of as megachurches today, they had then in the East, in places like Baghdad. They had a megachurch in Baghdad. In fact, one of the early caliphs, one of the famous early caliphs, one of his closest advisors was a Christian bishop in a Muslim world. In fact, when the Muslims set up their early School of Wisdom University, they modeled it after universities that the Christians already had, and they recruited Christian professors to come and teach in their university. What happened to that world? What happened to that Christianity? Let me give you an outline of a few things about that Christianity that you may not know. They had no understanding of Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night meetings. The word Baptist was completely unknown to them. If you had come and said, we're Baptist, or we're Pentecostal, or we're Presbyterian, they would have had, those words weren't even invented in the world at that point. When they had far more Christians in the world, in the Eastern world, than we had in the Western world. They had traditions you and I would find very odd. They celebrated holidays in the churches that looked nothing like the holidays that we celebrate today. They knew nothing of what we think of as, or what many Christians think of as Lent or Advent or any of those other supposedly Christian traditions on our calendar. They knew nothing about that. They had their own set, and they were very different than ours. They had a way of witnessing that would seem strange to us. They had a way of witnessing that put the gospel in terminology that could be understood by the people they were witnessing to. They had churches and seminaries in Tibet. When Buddhism was moving from India to China, the early Buddhist missionaries couldn't translate from the Indian languages into Chinese without the help of the Christians who already had large churches in China, who assisted them in translating the Bhagavad Gita into Chinese, partly out of scholarly interest for what the book said at all. And there seems to be some strong evidence when you compare the Chinese version with the Indian version that the Christian missionaries inserted Christian doctrine, whether deliberately or just subconsciously because that's the way they interpreted it, inserted Christian doctrine into the Chinese translation of the Bhagavad Gita. And you say, well, I didn't know that. No, hardly anybody knows that. The revival of the Christian church in China was a re-injecting of something that had been there 500, 600 years before in that area of the country. And they were gone. Now, I bring all that out for this reason. And here's how I want to tie it into what Peter says. We're going through a change right now. We're having this meeting virtually, right? I mean, that's what we're doing. What does ministry mean? And go ahead. Okay.
Let them know what's going on.
So we may be experiencing some technical difficulty. YouTube's servers sort of are parsing out time slots for everybody, and we get kicked off every now and then we get put into the next available time slot. So if you see us break away for a minute, don't change the channel. And don't give up on us. We will be back. All right. Thanks for putting up with the technical difficulties. And the point is, we've gotten so much into the idea of the open meeting, which is a biblical concept. It truly is right there on the surface of Scripture. But we get so much into our view of ministry. But even in church history, that wasn't always the view of ministry. That wasn't the way they saw it. When they saw ministry in the East, they saw it in a completely different way than you and I see it now. It would be worth you doing a little research to find out about some of the differences in the way Christianity has been over time. Because the way we see it now may not be the way it continues. And I think we ought to give some thought to. Just think about how we see this as an advantage right now in our church, right? We lost a lease. Why did we lose it? We really wanted to lose that lease. The Lord had motivated us to lose that lease, to be honest. We didn't want to pay another dime. If that lease went up 10 cents, we did not want to pay that extra 10 cents, right? We looked at the amount of space we had and what was going on in that building. We said, this thing, we're paying, our average monthly expense really was somewhere close to $5,000. And we used it one day a week for that expense. And we were thinking, how does this make any sense? Right? And we didn't know. We thought we would find another place to meet and continue the ministry sort of like it was. And so when we moved to the Y, we thought, first of all, praise God, the move is right across the street, right? And it was almost like right across the street, and it was so convenient. And they gave us a storage space to put some things in. We don't have to carry our stuff in and set it up every week, right? And all of that was so convenient for us. And now look at us. Now we're in a position where we don't have to pay that monthly rent to the Y, and we don't have that lease over our head. And it's a good thing, because if we did, we'd be spending that money on something that we wouldn't even use one day a week. Okay. 2 thoughts. If ministry is going to change, what is your ministry going to change into? What can you do that you're not doing today? Most of our ministry, and honestly, it's a strange thing. And those Christians from the East, the Church of the East, they called it, that was their name for it. The Christians from the Church of the East would look at the way we minister among ourselves and see it very strange indeed. They would see it strange because most people don't minister. Most people attend service and are served in a service.
That is true.
Rather than serving anyone. And they would have thought that was strange. Most of the church under persecution would look at the way we think about church and the very way we conceive church, they would find almost laughable. Because in their mind, the church had absolutely nothing to do with services. In fact, service in their mind was serving one another, right? Was making sure the other Christian families had some food this week in the middle of the persecution. Making sure Christian parents had someone watching their kids when they went off to work. And they lived in a Christian community that when we say the Christian community, they would not understand our concept of community. And I think we'd have a hard time understanding their concept of it. So my point is, if we're changing, What are we changing into? What's your role in it? And what are the possibilities of what it could become? Is there a day when we see the church not having a building at all for any reason? That would not be unusual in Christian history. And if that becomes the case for us, we should not think it strange, as though some strange thing befell us. We should look at it and say, wait a minute, no, this is not unusual at all. There were a lot of times and a lot of places in the world. You saw the note, if you were on Slack recently, you saw the note I put on Slack about the news out of China, where they want churches now, you need to display their supreme leader's picture in a prominent place in the sanctuary. And you need to sing the national anthem in every church service. And pastors have to submit their sermons in advance and have them approved before they can preach them. And they have to be facial recognition cameras set up at the front of the church looking out on the congregation. You understand what that means, right? That means we don't want you to have a church anymore. Okay. Really, is that strange? No, that's really not strange at all. Really, meeting house to house was the way the church started. What is your role going to be? And I just want to finish out reading a couple more verses here. He says in verse 13 of chapter 4, "But rejoice inasmuch as you're partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye. For the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or an evildoer, etc." Verse 16, "And if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on his behalf." And I want to jump all the way down to verse 19. "Wherefore, let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing as unto a faithful Creator." Christian parents, it has been a long time since we've had a persecution in our day, or that we've been close to. In fact, we've never seen it, where we feared for our children. We sort of hint at it, that, the state might come and take your children away from you if you're a Christian. We've got a lot of conspiracy theorists who say it's threatening to be that way. And who knows, maybe they're right. But you have them today.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's because everybody's streaming, so it's their server.
Back on?
Good, we're back. So there's a couple things I was thinking about on this. One is that we need to, I hope everyone is maintaining a very healthy perspective. I have difficulty thinking of this in any way in this situation we're going through, or that's happening, or whatever you want to call it, in any way that, in any type of terminology, as affliction or suffering, for several reasons. One is, I'm in the camp that I think it's overblown. But besides that, right now, the number one concern, health concern of our persecution is that we're all going to end up 20 pounds fatter by the end of it. So that's real hard to accept. I mean, if you went to anybody, right, in the first century church and said, "Oh, yeah, the typical thing, you get to the pearly gates and it's like, 'Hey, how was your affliction?' And we're like, it was horrible. Yeah. I gained so much weight, I couldn't hardly fit out the front door when it was over." I mean, I'm sure that the first century church would be like, "Boy, I wish I could be afflicted." I mean, if that's the extent of our problems, that we're like, HEB closes at 8 p.m. We can't get our midnight snack anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
This is not, even if we all stay home for 3 months and the disaster that'll wreak on the economy, we are so deep into comfort and prosperity. I really do think it'll take an extraordinary amount of time before we see any type of actual discomfort from this. A real that could historically be looked at and say, wow, the generation of 2020 really had it tough.
You're right.
Which is that's a good thing. I don't think we need to. Timothy says I'm talking about Albert. I'm talking about you, Timothy. Sorry. I told him I would read the comments if they put them on.
Yeah, that could get dangerous.
Yes, exactly. Albert says, "Hey." So it's just very important to maintain a perspective on this, and but a more serious reason why I think that's the case on the whole idea of suffering, and this is where I think is more serious, and that is there are one of the most significant difficulties for Christianity is the problem of suffering, which we've discussed in the Sunday schools back a couple months ago, and we talked about that. But if you go on and you look for opposition to Christianity or intellectual objections to Christianity or to the existence of God, to theism would probably be better said. Well, that's the number one thing. That is the one that probably has caused more thinking people to lose their faith than any other thing, is the issue of the problem of suffering. And one of the things, and Bart Ehrman is probably one of the most outspoken proponents of this as a problem for Christianity, goes around lecturing all over in churches and everywhere they invite him in to do this. And one of his things, or his main point he makes is that the Bible does not have an answer for the problem of evil. And his point he makes is this, is that it doesn't have an answer because it has like 20 answers. So every book you read has a different answer and maybe multiple different answers as to why people suffer. Job has several answers.
Yes,
each of the friends give answers, Job give answers, God in a way gives an answer, and this is I'm channeling his argument, is I want you to understand. This isn't my position, but I'm explaining his position,
yes,
or his argument. And so he says, he goes through it, the prophets all have different answers. Everyone has all these different answers as why there's evil. And I don't want to get into trying to respond to his points, but it is an issue that it is a point you find in the scriptures, that that suffering and the issue of suffering, almost every biblical author deals with it. Mm-hmm. They almost all deal with it, and the New Testament deals with it. And while I think, like for instance, the likes of Bart Ehrman and their view of this, their abuse of this issue is completely short-sighted. They're not giving the Bible any benefit of the doubt whatsoever, of many ways. But looking at it and saying, well, when I heard him say this, it made me want to look into it. I started looking into that and researching this a little closer. And it is true. Let's just take the New Testament. The New Testament authors deal with this extensively, and they deal with it severally in different ways. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very useful. One is because suffering doesn't take on it doesn't come in one package.
That's right.
And you can't attribute all suffering to the same thing.
That's right.
And so if we were to say all suffering is because you've sinned, which would be some of the prophets, right? That they didn't say all suffering, but right. They said this suffering is because of your sin.
That's right.
And they don't say all suffering in all human history is that, but they're saying this suffering is because of your sin. Well, if we would take that and do like the Pentecostals do and say all suffering is because of your sin, right? Well, then we would have a perspective on suffering that simply doesn't fit reality, exactly. And that's what Jesus said. They say, this blind man, why is he suffering? Is it because he sinned or his parents sinned? And Jesus said, no, this isn't about sin. This is something else. This is a different reason. And so then we got each of the authors of the scriptures dealing with suffering, and some of them multiple times in different ways, saying there are multiple reasons for suffering, and it's not a ready. You can't have a ready to bake answer for everything. You have to analyze them. And so it's interesting when you analyze what their reasons are. So like, for instance, the passage you bring up, Peter says, one thing he says is that when we're suffering, we should start off with the mindset that the ultimate suffering, which is dying,
yes,
is beneficial. There is positive effect to that.
That's right.
And that it is the ceasing of sin.
That's right.
So then when you're looking at it and you're afraid that, oh my goodness, we could die because of this persecution, he's saying, no, be positive.
That's right.
Not delusionally positive,
That's right.
but realistically positive, because if you've suffered, ultimately, in other words, if you've died, he's saying, you've ceased from sin.
That's right.
So right there, you can just look at that and say, okay, well then there is a huge benefit to even the most, even to the ultimate degree of suffering. There's an enormous benefit to it. But then he goes on and explains further, and that's what you kind of get into. He talks about not that degree, just common, everyday suffering. You shouldn't think that's strange. You're going to suffer as a Christian because the world's set against you. You're set against the world. It's kind of what I think Peter is saying here.
That's what he's saying.
You're sitting in a world. It's against you. You're against it.
That's
It is unavoidable that there's going to be conflict there. And as Christians, our goal is not to win a conflict
That's
of
right.
that. And so then the only option is to accept the suffering. Because we have no interest, our interest is actually against wanting to win a conflict, right? So some Christians, I think, very misguidedly thought, what we need to do is we need to make our own armies. We need to go out and we'll fight all these infidels, and we won't let them persecute us. Where Peter says, no, we can't do that, because that would be antithetical to what our goal is as the church.
That's right.
So I thought that was very interesting. Paul deals with suffering. Also, he deals it from a different way. Paul's basically, there's actually several, but one of his big things is, by suffering, we then can empathize and sympathize with people who suffer. And so we could never help people who are suffering from other reasons.
That's right.
Right? So people who are suffering from their own stupidity.
Right.
Okay? A lot of people are suffering because they're stupid. And I got, maybe that's not a word you should say on camera, but bless their heart, okay. No, they're suffering because they made foolish decisions. That would be a better way of saying this.
Yes.
They were foolish, they made foolish decisions with money or with vice or with marriage or whatever it is. They made a choice that was not smart. They ended up in a bad place. How can you help these people? Well, Paul says suffering, even if it comes from different areas, suffering itself is the same. So even if you're suffering because you made a foolish decision, that doesn't make your suffering less or worse than the person who's suffering because he made a good decision and the world's set against him.
That's right.
In the end, the suffering is simpatico. It's something you can come together on. You can sympathize with the suffering, and that's part of the problem with Christians that are overly judgmental.
That's right.
Right? Because they think, well, you're suffering because you made a bad decision.
Right.
I'm suffering because I'm a good person and the world's set against me. And so instead of realizing instead of being able to say, well, no, your suffering is actually the same as mine. It's like, you're poor because you're stupid. I'm poor because I'm holy. And the stupid person says, but you're poor, right?
Yeah, right.
So you're poor is what you're saying. That's how they're looking. Like, well, what's the difference? And yes, we could look at the cause of things and say, well, back up and causal. But once you're in the suffering, it really doesn't matter. And that's the problem with Christians that are overly judgmental. They want to go back and they want to relitigate every time on all the bad decisions that they made and talk about that. And what Paul is saying, no, I'm suffering for all the right reasons. Yeah. And it's given me the ability to sympathize and to console and to be a minister to people who are suffering for all the wrong reasons.
Yes.
Right? And so,
or for whatever reasons, whether right
whatever
or wrong.
Reasons, that's right. Correct. I'm using the two opposite extremes as hyperbole. But Albert Silva says that YouTube is going to take our channel down for calling him fat. Hey, Albert, pay attention to what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, we can solve that easily. Just send in a picture.
Yeah, send in a picture. That's right. That's just wrong. I don't approve of that message. So that was, as far as the suffering component of what you were saying, I just thought that I've thought that was very interesting how that is, and that even if this were to turn into suffering,
right,
which
I
still don't think it will. I seriously do not think it will. I think it would take a long time for that to happen at the rate we're going. But let's say it did. Let's say I'm completely wrong. The death rate continues to double every day. Pretty soon, every single person in the whole world has this, and 30% of everyone who gets it dies, which would be that would bring on suffering, real suffering in the world. That would actually cause it. And let's say that were to happen. Well, where does that leave us as a church or as a Christian? Well, it leaves us where all Christians have been, like you say, historically. And I've said this before, our little bubble of comfort is an ahistorical,
That's right.
delusional fantasy. We do not live in reality.
That's right.
We don't live in it. I did a podcast. I don't want to go into that, but if you want to listen to kind of what I'm thinking about on this, there's a podcast on our podcast channel, and you can look it up and listen to it and why it is. But we don't live anywhere near reality. And I'm not complaining.
Yeah.
I want to live as far from it as possible.
Yes.
Reality is that you starve to death if your crop fails in your backyard. That's
right.
reality. For most people over the entire course of human history, all around the world, that's reality.
That's right.
We don't live anywhere near that.
That's
Our
right.
reality is I was bummed because I wanted to make red beans and rice last night, and H-E-B closed at 8, and it was, 7:59. And for me, that's reality. Well, that's not reality. That's a wonderful fictional comfort to live in. And it'll take a long time before we're ever out of that, I think. But if we completely lost all that and we lived in actual real suffering where our problem instead of obesity was actually starvation and the state rounding dissidents up in the streets and things like that, well then we would have to confront that as a church and say, then why is it, what benefit can there be to that type of suffering? And that's what Peter's talking about. That's what Paul is talking about and when he deals with it.
Yep.
And there are things that we need to realize and say that suffering has a very important purpose in Christianity. In fact, Paul says that being a Christian, the mindset, it may not be your actual practical everyday living of it, but the mindset of a Christian should be to fill in their own body what lacks of the suffering of Christ.
Right.
So whatever Christ was, all of the suffering that Christ did, we could say, if anything was lacking of that in any way, if there was somebody who that suffering has not reached yet, in any way you want to, because people have theological issues on what he might mean by that, whatever. But however you want to theologically make that make sense, he's saying our view of Christianity should be is, if there's anything lacking of suffering, let it be on me.
Right.
I want to take on that burden, which is the burden that, people like, what's his name that went to Burma? Is it Adoniram Judson? Yeah, Judson, right? And those that went to China and went to these places and suffered for years and years for the gospel. That was their mindset. That was Jim Elliot's mindset and Elizabeth Elliot's mindset is, anything that might be lacking in suffering, let it be on me. Because it's part and parcel to Christianity. We have because of the fog of fiction that we live in, we've begun to think that what is part and parcel of Christianity is that the gospel makes us prosperous and happy and fat and without suffering. And when any type of suffering comes, we start wondering, well, maybe I've sinned.
Yeah. What did I do wrong?
Become real Pentecostal then,
Yeah.
right? For ourselves. So. That's one thing that I was thinking of when you announced that of talking about this, dealing with this as suffering.
Should we do Zoom next week?
All right. Yeah, we'll look into Zoom. I don't know. We'll try it. I don't know anything about it. Does it work the same way, or how does it work? We'll reset that. It could be our connection. Well, I'm going to be off. Go ahead. I'll be off in a minute.
We're going. We're on.
I think we're back. We'll see if that was the problem. It could be YouTube, or it could be us over here. Could be our internet. Could be this area saturated. Not only is every church broadcasting, but a lot of people allegedly who go to church are tuning in to watch it.
Hey, and just for perspective's sake, that really was about 2 minutes, which is the average commercial break.
Yes.
Right? Right? But it seems really long when you're looking at a blank screen like that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could turn this into a money-making thing and actually get commercials in that space. Huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. I think we're there. People are asking. I hope they see us. Let me see. Let me write a message there. Tell them see if they get that. So, anyways, what I was going to say, going to more to what you were talking about, and this is what we discussed last week a little bit after the meeting, wanting to discuss this week, was what does it look like? What does Christianity look like? What does the church look like in an environment?
We're back.
Yeah, well, it's YouTube then. Right. All right. Yeah, I don't think it's us here. I think this is YouTube just buckling under the strain here. It's 11 o'clock. Everyone's starting, a lot of people are starting streaming at 11. I bet that's what's going on. Okay. Well, very good. YouTube's going to have to add more nodes and stuff.
Is it that whoop sound I hear?
Hmm? We're going to try one more time, but if it keeps kicking us off, there's not much sense trying to go any further on this. And we'll have to look and see if there's another way we can do this later. We might be able to do it in a couple ways. Because we could try doing it YouTube and Zoom. We could actually try a couple of them. All right, it looks like this isn't going to work for any more for today. We got too many people are on, so we're going to go ahead and close it out for today. You need to, very quickly, every one of you need to find a way to contact each other, minister to each other. You need to remember that just because you're not going to church doesn't mean that you're not a Christian. And being a Christian is about a certain level of devotion. It is about the scriptures. It's about prayer. It's about the body. It's about ministry and evangelism. And we shouldn't think that you can take a vacation from that. You have to live as a Christian every day. And it's easy to do that when you have a church building and you have building responsibilities and you're going there, and as human beings, it's very hard for us to maintain any type of a discipline in anything if we don't have somewhere to go. I mean, you buy a exercise equipment and put it in your house. Most people will never use it except to hang clothes on. But if you go get a gym membership and you go there, once you're there, you'll use the equipment because you're going to a place to do it. And I know it makes it easier to go to church and to be a Christian when you're going to the building, and it certainly makes it easy. But it's likely we're coming up onto times when life is not going to be easy for us as Christians. And so I believe it's very important that each of us really put some serious thought into what it means to be a Christian if this were to extend. What if the deaths don't multiply every day? They're not going to open anything up. They're going to clamp everything down from now until the end of the year.
Even
maybe.
home church.
Yes, everything. They're going to have, like in some cities right now, have drones out, down going to, patrolling the streets, looking for anyone who's even stepping out of their house. And so, there's a possibility to this. You have to think about it at least.